If you're watching this, you're probably interested in the title like me, and that is the death and rebirth of the epic. And I'm talking about the epic in particularly in literary circles or in the literature space. But I think this also extends to other art forms, particularly film and television, but also, and a lot less obviously, songs and poetry. But before we get into this video essay, I just wanted to bring up a quick quote. And that is from Cormac McCarthy, the writer of Blood Meridian, a very well-known modern epic, although it was still written, 30, 40 odd years ago. But he says that if you think you're going to write something like the Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick, go ahead. No one will read it. I don't care how good it is. But first, before we sort of get too far ahead, I just want to look at what makes a story an epic so that we can have a concrete idea of what the form of an epic is so that we know what we're looking at, what we're talking about. And then we can go into perhaps what a revival looks at, but at the very least, what is causing the slow decline, or at least the slow descent of the epic as a whole. So in coming to know what the form of the epic is as it comes to literature, I want to talk about the shape first. And I think that epics, and particularly epic novels, they're shaped as a double helix, or at least they're often shaped like a double helix. Many of you will know this as it relates to DNA. It's a DNA spiral. And how do I think that this shape relates to the epic and what the shape of an epic is? Well, as you can see, we could say that the epic is basically layered and offshooting narrative threads and themes that, like genetic code, are sort of weaving together, forming the undercurrent of a larger, more obvious story. So like the double helix that you see on screen, the epic consists of recurring ideas and instances of foreshadowing that sort of work together to create a loop. This kind of mirroring of a story, the recurring, endless reiteration and copy pasting of the novel as short stories, sort of mimetically conditions the reader to absorb the message of the text, whether that be obvious, surface level, explicitly shown, or even absurd and vague. The point is that the epic is not defined by a point. It relies on being self-reliant. It creates its own world. It demands nothing of the reader other than expressing itself as a self-sufficient being. DNA it's constantly regenerates itself. So we'll look at some examples and characteristics of the epic, see why it's reinventing itself within contemporary literature. And first, I kind of wanted to just get into some examples of the epic, and the first one being Moby Dick. But basically, in Moby Dick, Herman Melville, the author, he uses the character Ishmael to orate the tale of Captain Ahab's conquest for Moby Dick, or also known as the Great White Whale. They are whalers. In this instance, Ishmael is the protagonist, you could call him, and Captain Ahab is the antagonist, but he's also kind of the protagonist. The story kind of revolves around him. And why is the story an epic? Well, many would say it's because of the grand scale or the sheer size of the novel. The novel takes place over 200,000 plus words within 100 plus chapters, and depending on the edition of the book that you're reading, that's going to be 500 to 700, 800 pages. So generally speaking, for a piece of fiction or memoir or even narrative nonfiction, to cover that significant word count, that indicates that there's at least enough story there to impose a sense of grandiosity, or at least short stories there to impose that sense. And I use Moby Dick as an example because, as we talked about earlier, it's sort of accepted as this grand epic, which I do believe it is. But I don't think it is because of this particular area. I don't think it's an epic because of its scale. And I actually think it falls short despite its size. And the reason is because a fair portion of that is blown up. It's essays, it's manifestos, it's Herman Melville, the author's thoughts on whaling, of the world, of the ocean, and the sort of jobs and the menial tasks that he experienced as a whaler. And it's just his thoughts on those things. And whilst they are on the topic of whaling, I don't think it necessarily contributes to the forward progression of the script. So in reality, Moby Dick is a 700-page novel, which is really just a 300-pager blown up. But I still think it's an epic. And so you'd be fair in asking why. Well, for me, it's the stakes. For Ishmael and the rest of the Pequod's crew, the Pequod is the ship. Captain Ahab's mission and his bloodthirst through his ambition puts their lives at stake. He is this unrelenting, vengeful assailant hell-bent on the demise and death of this mythical whale that's out there sailing, the world in all its watery expanse. It's the symbol that we don't really see. And we see this crew, kill a few whales, skin them, run the tasks of the ship. But as far as narrative value extends, it certainly wouldn't be uncommon for someone to say that the script is thin. This makes sense. I mean, have you ever met someone who's watched a Moby Dick adaptation? Maybe you have. But nevertheless, I think that there's this certain vibe that carries the reader through to the end. Some would say it's definitely a feeling of death, but to me, it's more of a sense of doom. It's this something around the corner, something lurking there. And what it comes down to is not this fear of the whale, but it's actually of Ahab and the fate that he is dragging the whole crew towards. He's this unrelenting passion and foregoings for life. And as a result, it kind of illustrates a mutilation of what living means. Because for Ahab, dying is just as much a truth within the Venn diagram of life as living is. So, whilst I think the stakes and the danger of this novel do propel Moby Dick towards its stages of an epic, it's not the only thing. Worth noting, the aesthetics of the language of the text. Moby Dick, it's actually more of a poem than a novel, or at least it can be argued. The language it takes from the King James Version of the Bible, and all of this, it just adds to the atmospheric appeal of the work, which contributes to its aura and beingness as an epic. And so that's a great example. The other example I just wanted to talk about in relation to scale and scope is Absalom, Absalom. And I think that this will, surprise a few people who are watching. I don't think it's necessarily that quintessential work like Moby Dick is. But, in Absalom, Absalom, the scope shines when it comes to aesthetically portraying the human existence, or at least, a human existence, a human experience. In this way, William Faulkner, the author, he's able to certainly be in conversation with Shakespeare, who's another master of the tragedy. Absalom, Absalom is a tragedy. But in the story, we follow Thomas Sutpen and his rise and fall within the deep south of a Jim Crow America. And it takes place on Sutpen's 100, which is Thomas's estate. And we see Sutpen's life as it is retold by a host of different characters who kind of just aim to recount and fill in the gaps of the tragedy that unfolds. Faulkner doesn't just use Sutpen's life to show his life, but he uses Sutpen as the central arc of which Sutpen's family and his workers' lives revolve. Thomas Sutpen is the sun, and his family and everyone else are the planets. So it's kind of this entire universe that is just pocketed down to one family and then one man. And through this family, Faulkner is able to reckon with the themes that he chooses. In this instance, it's the Civil War, pride and turmoil, racism within the South, and even dangerous love. All this is done by filling in the gaps and this sort of just revolving solar system around one man. So, in short, Faulkner's epic scale comes from his concern with experience as opposed to events. He's comfortable exploring the shadow of man, and he tries to reveal the innocence of how dirty humans really are. And he draws us into situations that are far from the norm, but where the people involved, they're no less our own kin, people just like us. And we see this clearly when Sutpen devises a plot to save two characters, a brother and sister, from an incestuous relationship, of which they're not actually aware of. They don't know that they're brother and sister. And Faulkner is actually able to illustrate the flow and effects of an imperfect world through imperfect people. Sutpen's plot fails because, unavoidably, the plan involves people who are full of nuance and imperfection. And as it unfolds, Sutpen's son actually dies after things go awry. And in this way, Faulkner shows the accidental nature of life, how little we understand both of ourselves and of the life leading us. And in this way, he paints life as this epic, grandiose behemoth that man cannot know. And that's why theme trumps plot when it comes to epics, in my opinion. I just wanted to quickly just talk about some contemporary masters of sweeping scopes. There's not too many of them, but I would say that Don DeLillo and Thomas Pynchon are probably the most notable examples. Don DeLillo captures consumerism, modern life, and modernity perfectly, especially in this postmodern world where those things are rampant. And we see this tons and tons in film and television, but not in literature so much. Thomas Pynchon, he shows paranoia, the effects of the war conspiracy. It's very schizo. His literature, it's kind of unseen before. But for both of them, it's this grand scale. They're taking the themes of this world, this globalized world, and they're condensing them into a novel. And that's how they're able to sort of touch upon those grand themes. And what's important to all of these works is symbols. Symbols are used mimetically to convey the reader the subconscious intentions of the text of the author. Symbols are used to layer into the mind what is really going on that isn't being said. When Melville's Ahab chases after the whale, it's not about the whale, but rather Ahab's sickness stemming from his internal shortcomings. He's chasing the white whale. He's chasing death. White is, you could say, is a symbol for purity, virginity. His search and dominion over the pure, it's a virgin kill. For Thomas Pynchon, which we didn't really talk about, but for those in the know, Gravity's Rainbow, which is his magnum opus. It takes place in World War II. The war is not just this ideological powers at odds. That's not what the war is. It's also the elite, deep-rooted evil that is ingrained within man and all that man wants, both intellectually, physically, and primordially. And if we want to talk about symbols, the V2 rocket, which the novel centers around, is literally phallus-shaped. So take that for what you will. So just for my first claim, it's just that readers today are not really willing to invest the time it takes to slog through 700 to 1,000 pages. So we must contain scale and scope of an epic within humble boundaries. Language that drags, it becomes offensive. It's arrogant because what it says takes too long to hear. Readers today, they want language that is full of specificity, weight, and is offensive because it's precise. Language that cuts deep and gets to the point. Language that, touches the soul, cutting into the heart by merely brushing the skin with its edge. The reader demands the ocean within a teacup. Conciseness is key. The way to this conciseness, though, is in mastering language. Language must be all things to all people. It needs to be universal. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is the universal appeal or universalism. In plain terms, we can understand universalism as anything that is ideas, values, or truths that apply to everyone, regardless of their individual makeup. That is things like age, background, race, etc. So within the context of literature, when we refer to universalism, think of themes, relations, experiences, the overall story and its components being of a nature that anyone can understand. A story that can teach or be understood as reliably beneficial to anyone, regardless of who they are in the stream of things. The idea of universalism within literature is certainly up for debate, as ironic as that sounds. And what I mean is that universalism as a concept within literature isn't necessarily universal itself. But to dumb it down for our purposes, we'll just touch upon a few cases where universalism is utilized within storytelling to engage the human experience. And so the most purported or acknowledged use of universalism within lit is when the author actually narrows down the focus of the text, putting the object of the story foremost before any message, teaching, or agenda. The opposite of this, we could say, is an allegory. The allegory's objective is to instruct or hide a deeper meaning behind a metaphor. The issue with this is that stories and art are interpretive. A novel will be experienced and grasped differently from person A to person B. Of course, one can argue that allegory and allegorical texts are still interpretive in nature, but as people with intellect and reasoning, we cannot ignore the obvious undercurrents that are within plots, characters, and themes. As children, we're taught Aesop's story, and I've got an image on screen now. Story of the hare and the turtle, where in the end, slow and steady wins the race. Can anyone actually prove what Aesop was thinking, what he was devising as he wrote his fables? Can we know what message he wanted to get across? Well, no, of course not. We cannot definitively prove these things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a prior motive, nor that we don't know it, even if we can't prove it. So the point stands that these fables, which act as allegories, they lose their power beyond just their narrow capturing of the world. They stand as tales to be interpreted once and moved on from. This doesn't tarnish their power necessarily or their value, but it definitely pigeonholes them. And this is not akin to what the epic is. One could actually argue that the universal appeal still stands with the allegory because anyone can understand these stories and their messages. For example, the turtle and the hare, no matter where you come from. And they would be correct. But in this way, we can suppose that universalism is not this concrete idea. It encapsulates a myriad of concepts regarding widespread appeal. One might say that allegory is universal in its understanding by all, but not necessarily in all's understanding in it. And we'll illustrate the inverse to try and make this more obvious. Take, for example, many of Kafka's nightmares, and I've got some images on the screen of one of them. We're looking closely at a novel like The Trial. For anyone who has read The Trial, you will know what I mean when I say who can know it. Many scholars and readers have grasped Kafka's notion of despair in the face of bureaucratic oppression. He grasps his existential themes very well, but no one can truly say that they own the story in the palm of their hand. For context, follow the lead Joseph K. Joseph K. is arrested for an unspecified crime that is mysterious to him, us, and seemingly everyone who is involved. And as the story progresses, we follow how Joseph goes about handling the situation and the insurmountable powers at play he must deal with. How does the novel capture the universal? By honing in on the protagonist, Joseph K., and the specific trial that he goes through. Kafka is able to touch the sublime by creating a self-contained theme. That is the theme of the trial, the specific trial theme. In this way, we can call one sense of universalism as being able to create a self-contained theme, one that can only exist within its own world. So for the trial, no one can explain the story by way of another story, or explain its message to someone who has not read it firsthand. The trial is perfectly itself and nothing else. It stands on the shoulders of its own Ouroboros. It's the self-contained image. The next example of universalism, timeless language. This is talking about the form itself. The points I'll make here are more or less subjective and open to interpretation, but more than this, somewhat abstract. So we'll explore examples to understand the idea at hand. Universal language is language understood by all. Understood by people from north to south, east to west, from eternity going back and eternity moving forward. This kind of language is not so common to see because it must escape the constraints of grammar, rules, dialectical intricacies, because these all restrict meaning by limiting understanding. And it also needs to escape the conventions of the time. This means avoiding trends or pop culture references. But in short, it must be timeless. We need timeless language. We'll take a look at a few examples of this kind of timeless language and how it affects the conveyed message of a seminal epic work. The brothers Karamazov, Blood Meridian, and later on Moby Dick, also known as the Karamazov brothers. This is Fyodor Dostoevsky's widely acclaimed magnum opus. It's his masterpiece. Its epic scale, not too dissimilar from Absalom Absalom, it derives from its themes. Themes concerning the humanities, forever in conversation with people and society. So as a work of existential literature, exploring philosophy and theology also, it deals with interrelated questions of human existence as a whole, which as the concept suggests, will always be with mankind. So that's timeless. We see this clearly in much of the earlier middle portion of the novel. I wanted to look at some examples from a chapter entitled The Grand Inquisitor. So within The Grand Inquisitor, Ivan Karamazov annotates a poem of his to his little brother Alyosha. And the poem speculates and proposes a meeting between the second coming of Christ and the Grand Inquisitor during the Inquisitions. What he talks about is this proposal of a situation where Christ is accused of heresy. The Inquisitor stakes the claim that by refusing the three temptations within the Gospels, Christ failed to uphold what humanity required most, that being security rather than freedom. It follows that the Church has corrected this by offering the earthly instruction that man desires. So we'll see here, first quote, "Man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil. Nothing is more seductive for a man than his freedom of conscience, but nothing is a greater cause of suffering." The next quote, "No science will give them bread so long as they remain free. But in the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, 'Make us your slaves, but feed us.'" And the last one, which captures it perfectly, "For nothing has ever been unendurable to man and society than freedom." So I just want you to notice the language that's used in all of these examples. Their assertions of Dostoevsky uses the Inquisitor, he's the one talking, as this interpreter. He gives him authority, which is used as the grounds for conveying a message. The word, it stands upon itself in the self-contained nature as the self-contained image spoken of earlier. Style and aesthetics, they also come into play. Style sets the mood of the text, and the mood controls the vibe, and as a result, the kind of aura of the text. A fine example of how style fashions an epic aesthetic is in the case of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. And I just want to show you the opening paragraph of that novel. It says, "See the child, he is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. He stokes the scullery fire. Outside lie dark turned fields with rags of snow and darker woods beyond that harbour yet a few last wolves. His folks are known for hewers of wood and drawers of water, but in truth his father has been a schoolmaster. He lies in drink. He quotes from poets whose names are now lost. The boy crouches by the fire and watches him." So I just want you to see the use of declarative sentences. Like in the previous case with the brothers Karamazov, Cormac McCarthy here has spoken with authority, claiming to the reader what is and what has happened without a broken or open clause. He's the orator he is this mythic, unknown yet all-knowing voice. There's a poetry or a musical element to the prose. And this is also seen in Moby Dick. Adding on is a stripped down punctuation, you'll notice. This is another stylistic choice. This rendering of the text preserves it because when the conventions and traditions of punctuation as we know them are no longer here, the text will stand forth. And conventions are always evolving. They will always change and die off. I just want to quickly read out as well a paragraph from Moby Dick. This is a perfect example of universal language. It says, "Consider the subtleness of the sea, how its most dreaded creatures glide underwater, unapparent for the most part, and treacherously hidden behind the loveliest of azure. Consider also the devilish brilliance and beauty of many of its remorseless tribes, as the dainty embellished shape of many species of sharks. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea, all whose creatures prey upon each other, carrying on eternal war since the world began. Consider all this, and then turn to this green, gentle, and most docile earth. Consider them both the sea and the land. And do you not find a strange analogy to something in yourself? For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, so in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all the horrors of the half-known life." He states this truth. This paragraph is as true today as it was hundreds, thousands of years ago, and it will be just as true in 1,000 years. I also now want to look at the inverse, taken from David Foster Wallace's magnum opus, Infinite Jest. Contemporary literature. It's from 1993, I believe. 500,000 plus word, 1,000 plus page, endless endnote tome. It's a masterpiece in storytelling. Its experimental structure in contemporary language is raw, it's virgin, it's unseen, it's original as can be. But it fails despite its scale because the language is too concerned with modern vogue. It's pleasuring an audience of the 90s, and it's already sort of dated. So for me, it loses that epic value. This is a chapter heading of Infinite Jest. How Incandenza's first extant written comment on anything even remotely filmic, submitted in Mr. Ogilvy's 7th grade Introduction to Elementary Studies, On-Field Tennis Academy. 21st of February in the year of Purdue Wonder Chicken, 4 years after the demise of broadcast television, 1 year after Dr. James O. Incandenza passed from this life. A submission receiving just a B plus despite overall positive feedback, mostly because its concluding was neither set up by the essay's body nor supported, Ogilvy pointed out, by anything more than subjective intuition and rhetorical flourish. The issue extends to all works that concern a movement or genre over its own self-contained image. One could notice this and say Wallace is writing a satire on satire, a kind of satire squared, if you will. Is it comedic? Yeah. True to its cause? Absolutely. It's certainly not timeless. And so, my claim here is that universalism, as it pertains to language, must be free from the pleasures of contemporary writing. It needs to transcend what is of the time, what is pulp, what is culturally accessible today only, and what is referential to the times while still staking a claim to its own portion of truth. It must say what is written on this day would lose nothing had it been written an eternity prior, nor would it change should it be postponed till an eternity into the future. Epic must be this forever circle, constantly suiciding and birthing itself. The reinvention of the epic must still hold true to a framework of timelessness. So the next thing I just want to talk about, and the last sort of point, is the canon and cultural value and the effect on society and culture. A true epic is valued by society, must carry weight aesthetically. The perfect instance become canonically important. C is referred to already. We've talked about the aesthetics of the Old Testament. And then also, I want to talk about Homer and his epic poem, pivotal within ancient Greek education. The Odyssey, as well, is reconfirming its importance within the canon in recent times with the soon-to-be-released Christopher Nolan adaptation. So yes, there's this mythic weight to these works and authoritative ground for which they convey their message. And there's an aesthetic style that transcends time. When a text is recognized by the people as important enough to be historically held, what is within, even if it is fiction, becomes as crucial as if it was the truth according to real events. Fiction that is canonized is truth within a single vein of literary history. And what is literary history but a retelling of what we see? Perhaps the most known canonized work of literature, which is the Gospels, tell the story of Christ and his earthly campaign. If we were to describe the timeline events simply and in succinct terms, one might describe them as follows. We have perfection to persecution, integrity, transcendence, and then ascendance. Does this sound familiar? This blueprint is redone and reworked all the time for centuries since. You know, even in the Superman story, who is Superman but a one-for-one Christ in costume? Shakespeare too is an example of how when a work is canonical, it speaks truthful and in turn epic. Controversial literary critic Harold Bloom, he authored a book entitled Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. And Bloom asserts that Shakespeare's characters were the first in literature to grow, change, and evolve through or via internal self-awareness or self-overhearing, like in the monologue. So in this way, Shakespeare is certainly the father of interiority. His tragedies, which are like Absalom mentioned earlier, and the Brothers Karamazov, detail the shadow of man, the pain and outline, and the innards of the human, his or herself, rather than just an experience itself. Macbeth and Hamlet are examples of these. They are epics because they stretch the possibilities of what man can be, and thus in turn what a tragedy can illustrate. And so the claim here is that it's hard, if not impossible, to accurately assess what works are written today because we don't know what will be canonized in the future. We can only speculate by assessing their literary or aesthetic value. A pure literary assessment, I would say much of McCarthy and Pynchon's bibliography shall make the canon, perhaps alongside DeLillo as well, though he also tends to lean into pop culture references, kind of in a not so self-referential way, which I'm not really a fan of when it comes to epics. But by this, one should not be blamed as foolish by also suggesting that David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest may also make the canon. But in his case, it would not be unthinkable for it to be forgotten soon into the future for reasons that we just mentioned earlier. So has the epic been killed? I don't think the epic has been killed, but it's definitely aging and it's not been remodeled as of yet. The first two claims that we mentioned, they dealt with the text makeup, how the text is constructed. The final claim dealt with the reception of the text. So what then can we be concerned of when it comes to reviving the epic? Well, if language must be universal and timeless, and then form must be transcended. Originally, the epic was only in verse. With Homer and much of the Old Testament, these were poems. But as time continued and form evolved, we moved on to the poetical prose works, such as in Moby Dick. And nowadays, the canon includes many a prose epic. The Brothers Karamazov and Blood Meridian alike are examples of such. But it's definitely time for a rebirth of form in the contemporary space when it comes to the epic. Many contemporary writers and critics, they will call this the new novel. But still I stand to assert, as in the final claim, that we can never really know which new novel will turn out to be the new flavor. That self-contained image, which culturally cements itself as part of the canon, or should we say as part of a history. No doubt that the form needs to change and that the epic needs a reshuffling. It needs to be shorter, it needs to be offensive, and it needs to be to the point. It has to be dangerous. It has to say what it has to say in a self-referential way.